said, you better kill me now. Kill me now, you go to jail.
Did you plan to kill your mom?
We dumped it in a big, huge trash can. We said we just want to go to school and act like we just missed the bus.
Your mom's got approximately 60 plus either cuts or stabs. Why weren't you or Taz cut more?
I would definitely give my life for her.
On January 13th, 2010, a frantic 911 call came from Conyers, Georgia. 2 teenage girls cried into the phone, saying they had come home from school to find their mother dead. When police arrived, they were met outside by 16-year-old twins, Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah Whitehead. The sisters were screaming, sobbing, and pointing officers inside. The scene waiting in the bathroom was a nightmare. Their mother, 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead, had been beaten and stabbed with such savagery that detectives later described it as one of the most violent cases they had ever seen. Her throat was cut so deep, she was nearly decapitated. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, and soaked into her clothing. This wasn't a quick killing. It was personal, chaotic, and fueled by rage. At first, the twins played the role of devastated daughters. They told investigators they had left early for school that morning and returned to discover the body. They gave interviews to local news stations, wiping away tears, pleading for justice, and begging for anyone with information to come forward. But almost immediately, detectives noticed the details didn't add up. Both sisters had fresh bite marks and scratches all over their arms and hands, injuries consistent with a violent struggle. Neighbors reported hearing shouting and banging from inside the home earlier that same morning, long before the girls claimed they had left for school. Forensic evidence made the picture even clearer. Nikki's blood wasn't just in the bathroom. It was in the twins' bedrooms. It was on their clothes. It was under their fingernails. The truth was obvious. The 2 sobbing teenagers outside weren't victims. They were the killers. To understand how it came to this, investigators dug into the family's history. Nikki had given birth to the twins when she was only 17. She worked hard to raise them, but as the girls grew older, the relationship turned volatile. Nikki was strict. She demanded discipline, curfews, and respect. The twins resisted at every turn. Their arguments grew violent, with police and child protective services intervening multiple times. For a period, the girls were even removed from Nikki's care and sent to live with their great-grandmother. But by late 2009, the state had returned them to Nikki, believing it was best for the family to reunite. Within weeks, Nikki was dead. For months after the murder, the sisters maintained their innocence. They sat for interviews, describing their mother as loving and themselves as heartbroken. They shook their heads, cried, and insisted they had no idea who could have committed such a crime. But investigators never believed them, and eventually, the evidence left them no choice but to confess. In 2014, both Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah admitted what really happened that morning. The fight had started like so many before it, an argument over control. But this time, it escalated into an all-out war. The 3 of them fought through the house. Hair was yanked. Nails clawed at skin. Teeth sank into flesh. The struggle was so vicious that all 3 left the fight covered in bite marks. At some point, knives were grabbed. The twins admitted stabbing their mother again and again, more than 60 times. They described dragging her body to the bathroom and leaving her in the tub before trying to clean themselves up. And then, incredibly, they went about their day. Later, they stood in front of cameras, crying crocodile tears, while the world searched for a killer they already knew. In the courtroom, the contrast was stark. On one side sat 2 petite, soft-spoken teenage girls who looked like they belonged in a classroom, not on trial for murder. On the other side were the crime scene photographs. Nikki's body, mutilated and left for dead in her own home. Prosecutors painted the girls as cold and manipulative, willing to lie to police, to their community, and to the world. The defense countered that the household was toxic, that Nikki herself could be violent, and that the twins lashed out in a storm of anger rather than a calculated plan. Ultimately, the evidence outweighed sympathy. Both sisters pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter, murder, and possession of a knife. Each received a 30-year prison sentence. Today, the Whitehead twins are in their late 20s, serving time in separate Georgia prisons. They will spend their youth and much of their adulthood behind bars, with no chance of release until they are in their 40s. The case remains unforgettable because of what it represents. This wasn't a murder committed for money or revenge against a stranger. It was the ultimate betrayal. Two daughters turning on the very woman who gave them life. The most haunting images are not just the blood-soaked crime scene photos, but the video clips of the twins performing grief for the cameras, crying about the loss of their mother, while knowing all along that they had killed her themselves. The murder of Nikki Whitehead forces an uncomfortable question. What drives children to kill their parents? Was this the eruption of years of resentment and rage? Or had something darker been growing in the twins long before that morning? No matter the answer, the outcome was the same. A mother's life ended, not at the hands of a stranger, but by the daughters she raised. Two identical sisters, more than 60 stab wounds, and a performance of grief so convincing that for a moment the world believed them, until the truth came out and the Whitehead twins became a symbol of one of the most shocking betrayals in American true crime. On a summer evening in Moscow in July 2018, police were called to a modest apartment block after reports of a man found dead in the stairwell. The victim was 57-year-old Mikhail Khachaturyan. He had been stabbed multiple times, his body riddled with wounds. Investigators quickly discovered the killers weren't strangers, criminals, or intruders. They were his own daughters, three teenage sisters, Christina, 19, Angelina, 18, and Maria, 17. The case exploded across Russia and far beyond, because this wasn't just another family tragedy. It was a crime that tore open the country's darkest rooms, raising questions about abuse, justice, and whether murder can ever be justified. Mikhail was no ordinary father. For years, neighbors whispered about what went on behind the closed doors of that apartment. The sisters later testified that their father ruled the home like a dictator. They described a man who beat them with belts and electrical cords, who screamed at them for hours, who locked them inside for days at a time. They said he treated them not as daughters, but as property. Even worse, the girls accused Mikhail of sexual abuse. They told investigators that he would grope them, force them to undress, and in Maria's case, rape her repeatedly. Family friends claimed the girls lived in constant fear, walking on eggshells to avoid setting him off. One neighbor remembered hearing their screams through the walls, but when police were called in the past, nothing happened. Mikhail had connections. He intimidated anyone who dared challenge him. By July 2018, the girls claimed they had reached a breaking point. That night, as Mikhail sat in his chair, they attacked him with knives and a hammer. The assault was brutal, but for them, it was survival. Afterwards, they left his body in the stairwell, called the police, and admitted everything. "We did it," they said. "We couldn't take it anymore." The confessions shocked the country. At first, many expected an open and shut case of patricide, but as details of the abuse came out, public opinion split down the middle. On one side were those who saw the sisters as cold-blooded killers. On the other, a growing movement that saw them as victims who fought back after years of torture. The case became a national debate about domestic violence in Russia, a country where protective laws were weak and victims were often left helpless. The investigation uncovered disturbing evidence to back up the girls' claims. Diaries and text messages revealed years of torment. Friends testified about the bruises they saw, the way the sisters flinched at sudden movements, the stories they whispered in private. Even the family's mother, who had left Mikhail years earlier, confirmed he was violent. The picture was clear. The girls had grown up in a house of terror. Still, prosecutors pushed forward with murder charges. Each sister faced up to 20 years in prison. The state argued that they could have run away, called for help, gone to authorities. Killing their father, they said, was not self-defense, but premeditated murder. The courtroom became a battlefield, not just of law, but of ideology. Feminist groups rallied outside, demanding the girls' freedom, chanting, "We believe them." Conservative voices argued that excusing patricide would set a dangerous precedent. The trial dragged on for years, with every development making headlines. The sisters themselves became symbols of a larger movement. For many Russian women, they represented the silent victims of domestic violence, trapped in homes with no escape. Their faces appeared on posters, in social media campaigns, even in international news outlets. It wasn't just their trial anymore. It was a referendum on how a society handles abuse. In 2020, the court finally reached its verdict. The sisters were found guilty, but with a crucial distinction. The court recognized that they had acted under the constant threat of abuse. Instead of decades behind bars, they received time in juvenile detention and suspended sentences. For some, it was justice. For others, it was an outrage. Today, all three sisters live outside of prison. They remain under supervision, but are free to build lives of their own. Their story, however, is far from over. The debate it sparked still rages in Russia, where domestic violence laws remain weak and protections for women are limited. For many, the Khachaturyan sisters are not just killers, but a symbol of what happens when a system fails its most vulnerable. What makes this case unforgettable is the collision of horror and sympathy. On one side, a father butchered by his own children. On the other, three teenagers who said they were fighting for their lives. The brutality of the killing cannot be denied, but neither can the years of torment that led to it. The world is left to wrestle with a haunting question. When home becomes a prison, when the person meant to protect you becomes your tormentor, how far can you go to break free? For the Khachaturyan sisters, the answer was murder. And in doing so, they turned their private nightmare into one of the most divisive true crime stories of the century.
No! No! Oh, no!
On May 17th, 2008, two middle-aged twin sisters from Sweden stepped into the path of a speeding truck on a British motorway. Seconds later, one of them was struck with such force she should have been killed instantly. Within moments, her twin threw herself into traffic as well. The entire sequence was captured by police cameras, footage so bizarre and disturbing that it spread across the internet like wildfire. Their names were Ursula and Sabina Eriksson. What happened that weekend in England has since become one of the most infamous cases of shared psychosis ever recorded. A story that begins with a near-suicidal stunt in traffic and ends with a stranger lying dead, stabbed to death by a woman who seemed to have completely lost her grip on reality. The twins were born in Sweden in 1967 and grew up in a troubled household with multiple siblings. They weren't known for violence, but both women struggled with mental health issues. By 2008, Ursula was living in the United States, while Sabina was raising a family in Ireland. They had little money and little explanation for why they suddenly decided to meet up in Liverpool, England. But once they reunited, something strange happened. Their behavior grew increasingly erratic, almost as if their bond as twins had sparked a shared delusion. On May 16th, the sisters boarded a bus headed toward London. Their paranoid behavior alarmed the driver. They clutched their bags tightly, whispered to each other, and refused to let anyone near them. Convinced they might be hiding drugs or explosives, the driver ordered them off. Stranded on the side of the motorway, the sisters made their way on foot along the busy M6 highway. That's where they were spotted by highway patrol officers, and that's where the nightmare began. The dashcam footage that followed is almost impossible to believe. As officers tried to reason with them, Ursula suddenly bolted into the road, throwing herself into the path of a massive truck. The impact shattered her legs. Seconds later, Sabina did the same, hurling herself into oncoming traffic and being struck by a car. Against all odds, both women survived. Instead of lying broken on the pavement, Sabina shocked everyone by immediately jumping to her feet. With paramedics and officers around her, she fought violently, screaming that the police were trying to steal her organs. She punched one officer in the face and had to be restrained by several people. Witnesses described her strength as almost superhuman, fueled by pure panic and delusion. The footage of the incident went viral. Viewers around the world watched in disbelief as two seemingly ordinary women tried to kill themselves in front of traffic, then fought off the very people trying to save them. But the story was far from over. Ursula was taken to the hospital with her crushed legs, but Sabina was released the very next day. Despite her bizarre behavior, she was charged only with assaulting a police officer and spent just a single night in custody. No psychiatric evaluation was carried out. Hours later, Sabina was walking freely through the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, wearing her sister's green jacket and acting like nothing had happened. That's when she crossed paths with 49-year-old Glenn Hollinshead, a local welder and dog lover, who saw her wandering and offered her shelter for the night. By all accounts, Glenn was a kind man, trusting and eager to help someone in need. He brought Sabina home, gave her food, and told friends he was worried about her, saying she seemed nervous and odd. The next day, N's kindness was repaid with horror. Out of nowhere, Sabina grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him 5 times. Glenn staggered outside, bleeding heavily, and begged neighbors for help before collapsing. Sabina fled the scene, hammering herself on the head on a roof tile before leaping from a 40-foot bridge onto the road below. Incredibly, she survived yet again. When she was finally taken into custody, her explanation was chilling. She told officers, "We say in Sweden that an accident rarely comes alone. Usually at least one more follows, maybe 2. In 2009, Sabina was convicted of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The court accepted that she had been suffering from a rare psychiatric condition known as folie à deux, or shared psychosis, in which close individuals share the same delusional beliefs. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Ursula, who never left the hospital during the stabbing, was not charged. What makes this case unforgettable isn't just the violence, but the footage. Millions have watched the motorway video of the twins running into traffic, a scene that looks more like a movie stunt than real life. And then, just when it seemed like the story couldn't get stranger, Sabina killed a man who had shown her nothing but kindness. The Eriksson sisters' case remains one of the most bizarre intersections of mental illness, violence, and chance ever recorded. It raises questions about responsibility, sanity, and how two people so tightly bonded could spiral so far from reality together. Ursula eventually recovered from her injuries and returned to the United States. Sabina served her time in prison and has since disappeared from the public eye, her current whereabouts unknown. Glenn Hollinshead's family, meanwhile, was left with nothing but grief, their loved one killed simply for opening his door to the wrong person. It's a story that continues to circulate online because it feels unreal. 2 women walk into traffic. They survive the impossible, and one of them walks out of custody only to kill a good Samaritan hours later. The footage, the randomness, and the sheer brutality ensure the case of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson will never be forgotten. In June 2000, Chicago police responded to reports of a fire in a vacant lot on the city's south side. When firefighters arrived, they found not just flames, but a charred body wrapped in a tarp. The victim had been shot in the back of the head, dumped like trash, and set ablaze in an attempt to erase the evidence. Investigators would soon discover that this wasn't the work of gang members or hardened criminals. The killers were 2 teenage sisters, Regina and Margaret DeFrancisco. The sisters were only in their late teens at the time, Regina 19 Margaret 17. To outsiders, they looked like ordinary young women growing up in Chicago. But beneath the surface, both were already living turbulent lives. Regina had been dating 22-year-old Oscar Velasquez, a local man whose relationship with her was rocky and filled with tension. Friends described it as volatile, a mix of attraction and conflict. And in June 2000, that conflict turned deadly. On June 6th, the DeFrancisco sisters set a trap. They invited Oscar to their family home, luring him in with promises of spending time together. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Once inside, the sisters put their plan into motion. According to prosecutors, Margaret was the one who pulled the trigger, shooting Oscar in the back of the head. Regina helped cover it up, wrapping his body in a tarp while blood still seeped onto the floor. Together, they dragged his body out and dumped it in a vacant lot. But they didn't stop there. In an effort to destroy the evidence, the sisters set Oscar's body on fire. Flames engulfed the tarp, charring the corpse beyond recognition. By the time firefighters extinguished the blaze, little remained except for a burned body and a crime scene filled with questions. For investigators, the case was initially a mystery. Who was the victim? Who had killed him? With his body badly burned, identification was difficult. But through forensic work and missing persons reports, police soon confirmed it was Oscar Velasquez. From there, the trail led quickly to the DeFrancisco sisters. When detectives tried to question them, the girls were gone. Regina and Margaret had vanished from Chicago, leaving their family, their friends, and their old lives behind. They became fugitives, traveling across the country under assumed names. For nearly 2 years, they stayed ahead of the law. The sisters' story gained national attention when it was featured on the television program America's Most Wanted. Their faces were broadcast into millions of homes, described as 2 teenage fugitives who had shot and burned a man in cold blood. The coverage worked. In 2002, tips poured in, and police tracked the sisters down. After nearly 2 years on the run, Regina and Margaret DeFrancisco were finally arrested. The trial that followed revealed the brutal details of the crime. Prosecutors argued that the sisters had planned the murder, deliberately luring Oscar into a trap. They painted Margaret as the one who pulled the trigger, but emphasized that Regina was equally guilty for helping to conceal the body, burn it, and flee the city. The evidence showed coordination, planning, and execution. This wasn't an accident or a crime of passion. It was calculated murder. The defense attempted to soften the image of the sisters. They portrayed Oscar as abusive and controlling, suggesting that the girls acted out of fear. They emphasized the youth of the sisters, especially Margaret, who was only 17 at the time. But the brutality of the crime was undeniable. Shooting a man in the back of the head, dumping his body, and setting it on fire went far beyond fear or panic. The jury agreed with the prosecution. In 2004, both sisters were convicted of first-degree murder. Margaret, as the shooter, received 46 years in prison. Regina, who played a key role in disposing of the body and fleeing justice, received 35 years. The sentences were harsh, but the public believed they were justified. The case had left an impression of cold-blooded calculation. 2 sisters acting together, not just to kill, but to erase a man's existence. Even more disturbing was their behavior after the crime. They didn't turn themselves in. They didn't express remorse. They ran, living new lives for 2 years until the law finally caught up with them. Today, Regina and Margaret remain behind bars in Illinois. They will be middle-aged women before they are eligible for release, their youth spent in prison cells. Oscar Velasquez, their victim, is remembered less for his own troubled life and more for the horrific way it ended. Shot by one sister, burned by the other, abandoned in a vacant lot. The DeFrancisco case stands out not only because of the brutality, but because of the betrayal. Oscar trusted Regina enough to come to her home. Instead, he walked straight into an execution, and it wasn't carried out by strangers or enemies. It was done by the girl he was dating and her sister, who worked together like partners in crime. On February 2nd, 1933, in the French city of Le Mans, one of the most infamous murders in European history took place. Inside a quiet townhouse, two sisters, Christine and Leah Papin, brutally murdered their employer and her daughter in an attack so savage that it shocked France and later inspired countless books, plays, and psychological studies. The Papin sisters were not strangers to hardship. Born in rural France, they grew up in a deeply troubled family. Their father was violent, their mother neglectful, and their childhood was marked by abandonment and abuse. Both girls were eventually placed in institutions and later found work as domestic servants. By their 20s, Christine and Leah were employed in the household of the Lancelens, a wealthy family in Le Mans. Christine worked as the cook, while Leah was the housemaid. To outsiders, the arrangement seemed stable. The sisters were quiet, efficient, and did their jobs without complaint. They lived in the Lancelet home, working long hours, but earning steady wages. But beneath the surface, tension brewed. Christine was fiercely protective of her younger sister and controlled nearly every aspect of her life. Their bond was so intense that many later speculated it crossed into obsession. The sisters were isolated, socially withdrawn, and seemed to live only for each other. On the afternoon of February 2nd, Madame Léonie Lancelin and her adult daughter, Geneviève, returned home after shopping. Monsieur Lancelin, the head of the family, was out at dinner and expected them to join him later. But when he arrived to collect them that evening, the house was dark, the door was locked, and no one answered. Suspicious, he called the police. When officers entered the house, they were confronted with a scene straight out of a nightmare. At the top of the stairs lay the bodies of Madame Lancelin and Geneviève. Both women had been savagely beaten, their faces smashed beyond recognition. Their eyes had been gouged out. Their bodies were mutilated with a hammer, a knife, and even a pewter pitcher. Blood covered the walls and floors. It was one of the most gruesome crime scenes France had ever witnessed. Christine and Leah were found upstairs in their shared bedroom. They were calm, lying together in bed, with the bloody weapons still in the room. When questioned, Christine immediately confessed. She said that when Madame Lancelin came home, an argument broke out over a minor household issue, possibly faulty electricity. In a sudden rage, Christine attacked her mistress. Geneviève tried to intervene, but Leah joined in the assault. The two sisters unleashed a frenzy of violence that lasted several minutes. By the time it was over, both women were dead. The brutality stunned investigators. It wasn't a quick killing. It was torture. The gouging of eyes, the repeated blows to the face, the mutilation. It all pointed to a deep eruption of hatred. Psychologists later debated whether the act was the result of long-suppressed anger at their employers, a psychotic break, or the product of their obsessive bond with each other. At trial, the Papin sisters became the focus of national fascination. Intellectuals, writers, and political groups all weighed in. Some saw the crime as proof of the oppression of servants by the bourgeoisie, an uprising of the working class against their wealthy employers. Others saw it as the product of mental illness, pointing to the sisters' isolated upbringing and obsessive relationship. Christine, the dominant sister, took most of the blame. Witnesses described her as intelligent but unstable, prone to sudden rages. Leah was quieter, more submissive, and seemed to act only under her sister's influence. When Christine was separated from Leah in prison, she reportedly became hysterical, banging her head against the walls and screaming for her sister. The court showed little mercy. In September 1933, Christine was sentenced to death by guillotine, though the sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Leah received a sentence of 10 years hard labor. Christine's mental state deteriorated rapidly in prison. She refused to eat, suffered violent outbursts, and eventually descended into complete psychosis. She died in 1937, at the age of 32. Leah served only a portion of her sentence before being released early. She lived quietly under a false identity, working as a hotel maid until her death in 2001. The case of the Papin sisters has endured for nearly a century because it embodies so many disturbing themes: class struggle, madness, obsession, and the terrifying capacity for violence hidden in seemingly ordinary people. The image of two maids, meek and obedient by day, transforming into sadistic killers by night, captured the imagination of France and the world. To this day, the Papin murders are studied in criminology and psychology as one of the clearest examples of folie à deux, a shared madness between two people so deeply entangled that they lose all sense of normality. And for true crime, the case remains one of the most haunting stories of family-like betrayal. Two servants who became executioners, gouging out the eyes of the women they were meant to serve. In India, during the 1990s, two sisters carried out one of the most disturbing series of crimes the country had ever seen. Their names were Renuka Shinde and shinde-gavit, and over the course of nearly a decade, they kidnapped and murdered dozens of children. Their crimes were so horrific that in 2001, they became the first women in India to be sentenced to death since the country's independence. Renuka and shinde didn't come from wealth. They grew up in Maharashtra in a family already steeped in crime. Their mother, Anjanabai, was a seasoned thief who raised her daughters to follow in her footsteps. From a young age, the sisters were taught to pickpocket, scam, and distract victims while their mother stole valuables. Crime wasn't just a temptation for them, it was a way of life, passed down through generations. But the sisters didn't stop at theft. They discovered that children could be used as tools for crime. A crying baby was the perfect distraction in a crowded marketplace. A toddler in tow made two young women seem less suspicious to police. So Renuka and shinde began kidnapping children. At first, they used them to help with their pickpocketing schemes. But when a child became too difficult to handle, crying too much or threatening to expose them, the sisters killed them without hesitation. The methods were cruel. Some children were strangled, others were starved, beaten, or abandoned. Investigators later determined that at least 42 children were kidnapped by the sisters between 1990 and 1996. 13 were confirmed murdered, though authorities suspected the true number was higher. The girls they kidnapped were often so young they couldn't even speak, making them easier to control and easier to dispose of when they became inconvenient. The cruelty shocked even hardened police officers. One case involved a 3-year-old boy named Santosh, kidnapped from outside a temple. When he wouldn't stop crying, the sisters beat him and slammed his head against a wall until he died. Another child was thrown from a moving vehicle. Time and time again, when a child threatened their criminal activities, Renuka and shinde silenced them permanently. The sisters were joined in their crimes by their mother, Anjanabai, and later by Renuka's husband, Kiran Shinde. Together, the family formed a small gang that treated children as disposable tools. Their spree continued for years, aided by the chaos of crowded cities and the lack of strong policing. Missing children were tragically common, and many of their victims were poor, their disappearances barely recorded. But eventually, the gangs slipped up. In 1996, police arrested Anjanabi in connection with a kidnapping. Under interrogation, she revealed enough information to tie her daughters to multiple abductions. Investigation began to piece together the horrifying pattern. Children vanishing in towns and cities wherever the sisters traveled, only for some of them to turn up dead. The trial that followed was one of the most chilling in India's legal history. Prosecutors detailed the cold-blooded efficiency with which Renuka and shinde kidnapped and disposed of children. They showed how the sisters treated kids not as humans, but as tools to be used and discarded. Witnesses described the brutality of the murders, and the prosecution emphasized the sheer number of victims. In 2001, both sisters were convicted of kidnapping and multiple counts of murder. The court sentenced them to death, calling their crimes rarest of the rare, a legal category in India reserved for only the most shocking and heinous acts. Their mother, Anjanabai, died before the trial concluded, and Renuka's husband received a lesser sentence. But for Renuka and Seema, the verdict was clear: execution. The sentencing was historic. Independent India had never executed a woman before. The case immediately reignited debates about capital punishment, gender, and justice. Some argued that women should not be hanged, no matter the crime. Others pointed out that their gender should not protect them from the ultimate punishment, especially given the cruelty of their actions. For years, the sisters filed appeals, dragging the case through higher courts and eventually all the way to the President of India. Human rights groups petitioned against their execution, while families of the victims demanded justice. In 2014, the Supreme Court upheld their death sentences, describing the murders as inhuman and beyond the realm of reform. As of today, Renuka and Seema remain on death row in Yawada Jail, Pune. Their executions have been delayed repeatedly, with debates over whether their mental health has deteriorated during years of confinement. Some argue that hanging them now, after decades on death row, would be cruel in itself. Others insist that sparing them would be a betrayal to the families of the dozens of children whose lives they ended. In a country where missing children are a tragic but common reality, the sisters exposed just how vulnerable the poorest and youngest members of society could be. They proved that even women, often stereotyped as caregivers, could commit acts of cruelty as ruthless as any man. And they forced India to confront a question it had never faced before. What do you do when the worst killers in the country are sisters, and when their victims are the most innocent of all? In May 2017, the city of Conyers, Georgia, became the setting for a murder that stunned the nation. The victim was 17-year-old Cameron Matthews, a high school student and athlete, described by classmates as friendly and soft-spoken. The killers weren't strangers breaking into the home. They were his own sisters, 15-year-old twins, Leandra and LeMay Matthews. Together with two friends, they plotted and carried out Cameron's murder inside the family's home. The Matthews family had long been known for dysfunction. Relatives and neighbors later told investigators the household was chaotic, marked by constant fights and neglect. The children often clashed, but no one could have imagined that the normal tension between siblings would escalate into cold-blooded murder. Yet for the twins, resentment toward Cameron boiled until they saw him not as a brother, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. On the night of May 23, 2017, that resentment turned into bloodshed. According to prosecutors, the twins invited two friends, a male and a female, both teenagers, into their home. Armed with knives, the four of them waited until Cameron was inside. Then they attacked. The ambush was brutal. Cameron was cornered, stabbed multiple times, and beaten as he struggled to fight back. Investigators later described the crime scene as chaotic, with blood on the walls and floor, evidence of a violent and sustained assault. Cameron was left to die inside the home he shared with his sisters. When news of the murder broke, the community was horrified. It wasn't just the age of the killers, 15 years old. It was the betrayal. A brother killed by the very sisters he had grown up with. Twin sisters who, instead of protecting family bonds, had orchestrated his death, with friends looking on. The investigation revealed that this was no impulsive fight. Police uncovered how the sisters had plotted with their friends ahead of time. They had armed themselves and discussed their plan. Prosecutors argued that the attack was premeditated, carried out with intent, and that the twins showed no hesitation once the violence began. For detectives, it was chilling to see teenagers acting with such calculation against their own brother. In the courtroom, the betrayal took center stage. Prosecutors told the jury that Cameron had no chance, ambushed by four attackers in his own home. They described the sisters as ringleaders, pulling their friends into a deadly conspiracy. The crime, they argued, was not a tragic accident. It was murder born from hatred. The defense tried to shift the story, pointing to the toxic environment the children had grown up in. They described a broken home filled with dysfunction, neglect, and violence. They claimed the twins were not hardened killers, but products of their environment, too young to understand the weight of what they had done. But even if the family home was fractured, the evidence of planning was undeniable. By 2019, the case had reached its conclusion. The twins were tried as adults, despite being only 15 at the time of the killing. Both pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. Each was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Their two friends received similar sentences. The verdict brought justice for Cameron, but it left the family shattered. One child dead, two serving decades in prison. People debated how young teenagers could conspire to commit such violence, and whether the dysfunction in their home explained the tragedy or merely set the stage for it. Today, Leandra and Namay are in their early 20s, serving their sentences in Georgia prisons. They will be middle-aged before they have a chance at release. Cameron, meanwhile, is remembered by classmates and friends as a boy who never got the future he deserved. His death wasn't at the hands of criminals from outside his home, but by the very people who should have been his closest allies. In the years between 1919 and 1921, the Egyptian city of Alexandria was plagued by a wave of mysterious disappearances. Women were vanishing from the streets, never to be seen again. Families searched in vain, rumors spread through neighborhoods, and fear consumed the city. For months, police found no trace of the missing, no bodies, no evidence. But when the truth was finally uncovered, it shocked the entire nation. The women hadn't disappeared into thin air. They had been lured, robbed, strangled, and buried beneath the floors of houses run by two sisters, Raya and Sakina. To neighbors, Raya and Sakina seemed like struggling women just trying to survive in the poor Lubin district of Alexandria. They lived in modest homes, kept to themselves, and gave no outward sign of the horrors unfolding inside. But behind closed doors, they were orchestrating one of the deadliest killing sprees in Egypt's history. Alongside their husbands and two male accomplices, the sisters preyed on women who trusted them and turned their homes into slaughterhouses. The victims were mostly women of lower social standing, sex workers, poor wives, women who worked in markets. Raya and Sakina knew exactly how to lure them. They offered alcohol during prohibition, promising companionship, money, or simply a safe place to relax. But once a woman stepped inside, the trap was sprung. The sisters worked with precision. One would distract the victim while the others attacked. The women were pinned down, strangled with scarves, and robbed of their jewel. Their bodies were then buried under the dirt floors of the very homes where they had been welcomed. For nearly 2 years, women disappeared across Alexandria. Panic gripped the city, but police struggled to make progress. Many of the victims came from poor families, and their cases were not treated with urgency. Missing women were common, and without bodies, rumors flourished. Some thought human traffickers were to blame. Others whispered about curses. The truth was far worse. The killers were two sisters, living among them. The breakthrough came in late 1920. Police, acting on a tip, searched one of the sisters' homes. Beneath the packed dirt floor, they uncovered human remains. Digging deeper, they found more. Jewelry belonging to missing women was recovered from the house. The investigation quickly spread to other properties linked to Raya and Sakina. Each search revealed more bodies. By the time the case was closed, at least 17 women had been confirmed murdered. The news spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed lurid details, describing the sisters as monsters who betrayed their gender and their community. Egypt had seen violence before, but never had women been revealed as the masterminds behind serial killings on this scale. The case shattered cultural expectations and left the public horrified. In 1921, Raya and Sakina, along with their husbands and two accomplices, were put on trial. The courtroom was packed with journalists and grieving families. Witnesses testified about screams heard from the houses, about women lured inside and never seen again. The evidence was overwhelming. The remains of the victims, the stolen jewelry, the confessions of accomplices, all pointed directly to the sisters as leaders of the gang. Prosecutors argued that the murders were driven by greed and a complete lack of conscience. The women had not killed in desperation or in defense. They had killed systematically, again and again, for profit. The defense tried to argue poverty and circumstance, but it carried no weight. The sheer number of victims, 17 confirmed, with suspicions of more, left no room for mercy. The verdict was historic. Raya and Sakina were sentenced to death by hanging, along with their husbands. In 1921, they became the first women ever executed in modern Egypt. Even a century later, the story of Raya and Sakina remains infamous across the Arab world. Their crimes have been retold in plays, films, and television dramas. Their names are shorthand for treachery. On March 30th, 2005, Dubliners were horrified by a gruesome discovery. Along the Royal Canal, plastic bags were seen floating in the water. Inside were severed limbs, arms, legs, even a torso. Over the following days, more bags were recovered. Each contained more pieces of the same body, but the head and the hands were missing. Without them, identifying the victim was nearly impossible. The press swarmed the story, calling it one of Ireland's most disturbing murders. When the killers were revealed, the shock only deepened. They weren't hardened gangsters or shadowy criminals. They were two sisters, Linda and Charlotte Mulhau. The victim was 38-year-old Farah Swela Noor, a Kenyan immigrant. Noor was no stranger to violence. He had a long criminal record, including convictions for assault and rape, and was feared by many who knew him. But his own violent history did not lessen the horror of what was done to him. Noor wasn't simply killed. He was butchered, dismembered, and scattered across Dublin. That night, Noor had been drinking with Kathleen Mulhall, the mother of Linda and Charlotte. Kathleen had been romantically involved with him, and her daughters joined them at her flat. All three women had been drinking heavily and using cocaine. The atmosphere quickly turned volatile. Noor, intoxicated and aggressive, allegedly threatened the sisters. What happened next would make headlines around the world. In a sudden frenzy, Charlotte grabbed a kitchen knife and attacked Noor. She stabbed him repeatedly in the chest and neck, the blade plunging deep as Linda helped restrain him. The attack was frenzied, a storm of blows fueled by alcohol, drugs, and anger. Noor collapsed and died on the floor of Kathleen's flat, his blood soaking into the carpet. But the killing was only the beginning. With the body on the floor and panic setting in, the sisters decided to dispose of him themselves. What followed was one of the most gruesome dismemberments in Irish criminal history. Using a knife and a pair of scissors, they began cutting Noor apart. His arms and legs were severed. His torso was sliced into sections. His head and hands were removed entirely and never recovered. A deliberate attempt to erase his identity. The sisters worked for hours, sawing through bone and flesh, while their mother remained in the flat. When they were finished, they stuffed the remains into plastic bags. Some were dumped into the Royal Canal. Others were left in bins around the city. For days afterward, Dubliners watched in horror as police pulled human remains from the water. Without a head or hands, identification was slow, but investigators soon pieced together the victim's identity, and suspicion turned toward the Mulhalls. Witnesses confirmed Noor had been with them that night. Forensics tied the apartment to the killing. By late 2005, both sisters were arrested. The case quickly became a media sensation. The brutality of the crime, combined with the shocking fact that it had been committed by two young women, captivated the nation. Journalists gave the sisters a nickname that stuck immediately: the Scissor Sisters. In court, the sisters admitted their involvement, but tried to shift the blame. They claimed Noor was violent, that the stabbing was done in panic and self-defense. But prosecutors dismantled that argument. Noor had just been killed. He'd been cut into pieces deliberately and systematically. The missing head and hands told the jury everything they needed to know. This was not panic. it was calculated. The trial exposed details that horrified the public. Jurors saw photographs of the canal where the bags had been found. They heard testimony about the tools used to dismember the body. They listened to accounts of how the sisters carried the bags through the streets of Dublin, disposing of them like garbage. For many, the most chilling detail was the missing head and hands. They were never recovered, and their absence made the case feel even more sinister. In 2006, the verdicts were delivered. Charlotte Mulhall was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Linda, described as less dominant but still deeply involved, was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years. Their mother, Kathleen, later received a 5-year sentence for helping to dispose of the body. The Scissor Sisters case left Ireland reeling. Nor's reputation as a violent offender complicated public reaction, but the savagery of his death overshadowed everything. For many, the dismemberment was the true horror. The idea of 2 young women, drunk and high, methodically cutting up a man's body in their mother's apartment was something the country had never seen before. Over the years, the case has been retold in documentaries, books, and endless debates. Some argued the sisters had been pushed over the edge by Nor's aggression. Others insisted they had chosen brutality willingly. What no one disputed was that they turned a drunken night into one of Ireland's most infamous killings. Today, Charlotte remains behind bars, serving her life sentence. Linda was released after serving 12 years of her 15-year term. Their mother completed her sentence and faded from public view. But the name that the press gave them, the Scissor Sisters, has endured. It has become shorthand for one of the most shocking sibling crimes in Irish history. 2 sisters, 1 man stabbed and butchered, plastic bags filled with body parts floating in Dublin's canal, and a head and hands that were never found. The case of Linda and Charlotte Mulhall will forever stand as one of the darkest and most unforgettable crimes Ireland has ever seen. In the dusty hills of Guanajuato, Mexico, during the 1950s and 1960s, a nightmare was unfolding behind closed doors. 2 sisters, Delfina and Maria de Jesus Gonzalez, better known as the Poquianchis sisters, ran what appeared to be a set of brothels. But beneath the surface, they were presiding over one of the deadliest killing sprees in Mexican history. Over the course of years, they lured, exploited, and murdered more than 90 young women, making them 2 of the most prolific female serial killers in the world. The Gonzalez sisters didn't come from wealth, but they came from power. Their father, Isidro Gonzalez, was a violent and abusive man who ruled their household with an iron fist. He was known as a local strongman in their hometown of El Salto de Juanacatlán, Jalisco, and his influence gave the family a reputation. Delfina and Maria grew up learning that control came through violence, and they carried those lessons into adulthood. By the 1950s, the sisters had established a network of brothels in Guanajuato and Jalisco. On the surface, they were businesswomen, but behind the walls of their establishments, horror reigned. The sisters preyed on vulnerable young women, runaways, poor girls, or those promised jobs as housemaids. Many were tricked with offers of honest work, only to be forced into prostitution once inside. Once they were trapped, there was no escape. The brothels were prisons. The women were beaten, starved, and subjected to constant abuse. Those who resisted were tortured. Those who tried to flee were killed. And when the women became too ill, too old, or simply no longer profitable, Delfina and Maria ordered their deaths. Their bodies were buried in mass graves near the properties. It wasn't just the sex workers who suffered. Customers who brought too much attention, or men who had too much money, sometimes met the same fate. They were robbed, killed, and disposed of like the women. The sisters ran their empire with cold calculation, driven entirely by greed and power. For years, their crimes went unnoticed by authorities. Corruption and fear played their part. Local officials often turned a blind eye. either bribed by the sisters or too afraid to confront them. Missing girls were common in poor communities, and few families had the resources to pursue justice. The Gonzalez sisters thrived in this environment, growing their criminal enterprise while dozens of women disappeared into their brothels. The truth began to unravel in 1964. A woman managed to escape from one of the brothels and went to the police. At first, her claim seemed unbelievable. Mass killings, graves filled with bodies, women enslaved by two sisters. But investigators followed the lead, and what they found shocked the nation. Raids on the sisters' properties revealed graves filled with the bodies of women and children. Reports suggested that some victims had been as young as 12. In total, more than 90 bodies were recovered. Witnesses testified about the brutal conditions inside the brothels, describing how women were starved, beaten, and killed at the sisters' command. The Gonzalez sisters were arrested, along with members of their criminal network. The trial became one of the most infamous in Mexican history. The press dubbed them the Poquianchis, and their story dominated headlines. In court, the sisters showed little remorse. They denied responsibility for many of the killings, blaming subordinates or circumstances. But the evidence was overwhelming. The graves, the testimony of survivors, and the sheer number of bodies left no doubt. In 1964, Delfina and Maria were convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to 40 years in prison, the maximum penalty in Mexico at the time. For many, the sentence felt far too lenient given the scale of their crimes. Life in prison brought its own dark ending for the sisters. In 1968, Delfina died after a construction accident in Irapuato prison. A worker accidentally dropped a bucket of cement on her head, killing her instantly. Maria lived much longer, serving her sentence until her release in the 1990s. She died in 1998, a name still infamous across Mexico. The story of the Poquianchis sisters remains one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. They were not isolated killers acting in madness. They were organized, methodical, and motivated entirely by profit. They built a criminal empire on the suffering of women, using deception to lure victims and violence to control them. Their crimes revealed not only their own depravity, but also the failures of a system that allowed them to operate for years without consequence. What makes their case unforgettable is the scale. This wasn't one or two murders. This was industrialized killing. More than 90 lives were destroyed, and countless more were scarred by the trauma of being trapped in their brothels. They remain a reminder that some of the worst atrocities are not committed by men in wars or gangs, but by women who turned family loyalty into a partnership in mass murder. The Gonzalez sisters, the Poquianchis, remain among the deadliest women in recorded history. And there you have it, 10 of the most twisted, shocking, and unforgettable cases of sisters who crossed the line from family into killers. From teenagers turning on their own mother and brother, to sisters who built entire empires of death. These stories remind us that blood ties don't always mean loyalty. Sometimes they mean betrayal. Which case chilled you the most? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you don't miss our next deep dive into the darkest crimes ever committed. Because as we've seen, sometimes the darkest killers aren't strangers at all, they're sisters.